Hi, I'm Glenn Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. This TV series explores a variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolent social change. We are now 4 years into a war against Iraq and the military occupation that has been following in that sovereign nation. It's overwhelmingly clear that the war is illegal under both international law and federal law. A great many people worked very hard to prevent our government from starting that war, and we've continued to work over the past 4 years trying to stop the war. The government continuously turns a deaf ear, refuses to accept responsibility for what it has destroyed, and now escalates the war by sending even more U.S. troops into harm's way. During this program, you'll see how some people are taking personal responsibility to stop the war right in their own communities. And 4 of those people are guests on the program, and they'll be sharing their experiences and their information and insights. I'm happy to welcome 4 members of the Port Militarization group here, and we have Caitlin Esworthy, TJ Johnson, Molly Gibbs, and Phan Nguyen. Happy to have you all here. This is going to be a very interesting show. People may have seen things in the news about this. A lot of people that I've talked to, even more mainstream folks, know somebody who's actively been participating. I wonder if you could, Caitlin, just summarize what the Port Militarization Resistance movement is about.
Sure, Glenn. Thanks for having us here. Port Militarization Resistance, or PMR, started exactly a year ago after the shipment of the Stryker vehicles through the Port of Olympia in May of 2006. So we began as a direct action-based group, exercising civil disobedience, organizing to try to stop the Strykers and to end our complicity in the war in Iraq. And we have been continuing to organize throughout that time and up until the Port of Tacoma and the Port of Grays Harbor in Aberdeen.
And when I was introducing the program, I said that this war is clearly illegal and that the occupation of Iraq is illegal. Is there anything else that somebody could add to that? On what basis do you find that it's illegal, or, I didn't give much in the way of reasons, but there are a lot of reasons out there. I wonder if somebody could share some of those.
I can start with one. I think something I think about almost daily is what we've done to the infrastructure in Iraq, starting with Bremer's 100 orders, it's completely illegal to go into another nation, a sovereign nation, and take apart the banking system. It's not legal to occupy another nation and take over their economic system. So, and that of course extends to water, food, everything that people need to survive. We as an occupying nation are responsible for people's health and well-being.
If I could add to that, the legal framework for me is rooted in the Constitution of the United States, Article 6 in particular, which says that foreign treaties are the law of the land in the United States. And this war has violated a variety of foreign treaties signed by this country, most notably the United Nations Charter, which specifies the conditions under which war is justifiable. Those conditions were not met. Therefore, it's a violation of the UN Charter, and by extension, a violation of Article 6 of the Constitution. It's very clear legal reasoning that has been put forward on that grounds.
If I could add just a little bit. When we phrase the question as on what basis is the Iraq war illegal, a better question would be on what basis is the Iraq war legal at all? And it has no legal basis. The United States was not under attack or not under the threat of an attack from Iraq. And as well, the United States has much of a right to be in Iraq as, say, Iran does or China does. So the question would be, what right do we have to be in another sovereign country?
Yeah, any more than they would have a right to come here and overthrow our government and occupy us and take our natural resources.
Yeah.
So.
I think PMR has been framing its actions within that framework. We don't consider this a war of aggression a legitimate act, and anything that we do as a group is an act of direct action, a nonviolent direct action in a form of civil resistance against an illegal war.
I can imagine people criticizing the efforts that what you've been doing at the local ports by saying, well, you shouldn't do those kinds of things. Why don't you just limit yourself to more acceptable kinds of things like lobbying and voting? So how do you answer that?
Boy, I think collectively we've put thousands of hours into all of those things that one does to notify legislators that you're displeased with the actions that are being taken. So email, lobbying in Washington, D.C., lobbying locally. We've done everything under the sun, and it's very clear to me at this point in time that we have a failed Congress. So we can't count, there is no leadership that's going to put things right or take the appropriate actions that need to be taken.
You're talking about the new Congress as well as the Congress that we've had for
both. Yeah, the
before.
Previous Congress was written up in a foreign policy journal for the last Congress. This Congress is also a failed Congress. They failed to act. The mandate of the people is we want our soldiers home. We want an end to this illegal war, and I don't see that happening.
I think it's very important to recognize that nonviolent civil disobedience, direct action, the tactics used by PMR are not tactics of first choice. They're tactics of last resort because, as Molly said, all of the other options have failed to produce the results of ending the illegal war. So the only thing left at that point is civil disobedience and direct action.
Yeah. The Constitution even provides for impeachment as a constitutional way of removing an out-of-control, totally irresponsible, law-breaking executive, and the Congress won't even invoke that provision that's already written in the Constitution as the remedy for precisely this kind of thing. So when you've exhausted all your administrative remedies, as the bureaucratic term would be, then what else is there? It seems as though there's a long history of people taking personal responsibility when things are beyond acceptability. And you think back to when this country was founded, when people signed the Declaration of Independence, which was illegal to break away as a colony and say we're independent of Britain because you folks have treated us so shabbily. And there's just a long history. I wonder if you could talk about other historical precedents for occasions where people need to kind of stand up and do the right thing.
Well, I mean, this is supposed to be a democracy here. And we talk about, a lot of times, especially like Bush or other advocates of the war, talk about defending our freedoms. And they talk about this whole concept of freedom in the abstract, when I think we really need to think about what are our freedoms. If we talk about, for instance, the First Amendment, do people go over to Iraq to protect our First Amendment rights? Are our First Amendment rights at risk by Iraqis right now? Who is putting our First Amendment rights at risk? And so if you think about all the freedoms that we have, they've all been gained by people going out in the streets, people going out and taking what is theirs, their rights, and just saying, these are my rights, and I'm going to stand up for them, and I'm going to assert myself. It's all about, democracy is not just about playing a game of a set of rules, especially when our leaders are not playing by those same rules. Democracy is about standing up for ourselves. Democracy is about empowering ourselves, because our leaders aren't there to lead us. We are the leaders, and we are supposed to be appointing people to represent us. And when they're not representing us, then we need to go out there and make some change and make it happen.
That's a very Jeffersonian approach. That's exactly the spirit that this country is founded on, and that's exactly the spirit that's in the Declaration of Independence.
Phan, you remind me of a specific situation so much. I was going to Senator Cantwell's office one day, 80-year-old Korean War vet, 70-year-old woman, 2 young people, and we walk up to the door, and right on the door is a notice. This door is locked. The message was, we don't want to hear you. We don't want to hear your message. And that will stay with me. Just, you so beautifully articulated. That's what this is all about. So we wind up in front of riot gear police, ironically just trying to get a message across. And there's no one to listen. It's a very bizarre situation.
I think it's important, too, to remember that most of the significant social progress that has been made in this country has been made in part as a result of direct action and civil disobedience. Whether you're talking about the abolition of slavery, women's suffrage, the equal rights movement, or even the early environmental movement, much of that was rooted in direct action. And the positive change that came about would not have come about, or would have come about much more slowly had those tactics not been used.
Yeah, it was during the 1800s. It was illegal to help slaves escape from slavery. The law, the Fugitive Slave Act, required you, if you happened to find a slave who had escaped, the law required you to return that slave to the slave owner. And people, fortunately, broke the law and said, no, I'm going to help the slave get away to freedom. And even in this century, the civil rights movement. I mean, look at how many dozens of times Martin Luther King broke laws, went to jail, because there are some important points that the system was not recognizing.
It's important to remember, too, that there are members of the United States Congress that were with Dr. King when he broke those laws.
Yeah, John Lewis.
John Lewis being one of those.
Yeah, was very active with the movement for voting rights. I want to show something that I had from the Vietnam era. A lot of people don't realize that during the Vietnam era, a very large portion of the ammunition and war supplies going to Vietnam were shipped out of the Navy port at Bangor, where the Trident nuclear submarine base was subsequently built. And during the Vietnam War, ocean-going freighters would come up to the Bangor port. War materials would come in on the rail line, the same rail line that brought in the missile motors and the White Train nuclear weapons to the Trident base. And they would unload these, and the stuff would be loaded onto the ships, and they would go. And you'll see in this photo, it says People's Blockade on the left and right margins. And at the bottom of the photo, you see some little boats, and people would camp out there on the hill overlooking that port. And when it looked like the ship was about ready to go, they would get down in the boat and get out and block the way. and this was the People's Blockade, and it was active in the early 70s. And on Nagasaki Day of 1972, about 150 of us went out and sat on the railroad tracks, notified the Navy that we'll be on the and the railroad that we'd be on the tracks, and stopped. We prevented the Navy from running the ammunition train that day on Nagasaki Day in 1972. The following Tuesday, 6 people came back, chained themselves to the tracks. They were arrested. This was at the height of the Vietnam War. They went to trial in Port Orchard, where the courthouse was for Kitsap County, the heavily Navy-oriented county. The jury acquitted them because they said, if it's wrong to do that, you should have arrested all 150. If you're going to arrest these 6 only, it's not fair just to pick on a small number. So the moral to the story was there is safety in numbers, and that even during the height of the Vietnam War, in that very heavily Navy-dependent county, it was possible to get a jury to acquit when they could see that the government was treating people unjustly. So anyway, it was great. So I've had this up in my house for a long, long time. So
I was
fun.
just hoping to address some things that
Yeah.
were brought up by
Yes.
these fine people next to me. We use the term civil disobedience, and I think part of it's out of habit, and part of it's out of a strategic usage of nostalgia, having to deal with. You're bringing up issues of the civil rights, the civil rights era, conventional, and then slavery and stuff like that. And that's when slavery and segregation were legal. Working within the framework that we do with PMR, that the war is illegal, we are committing law-abiding acts by resisting these shipments. And I think that's important to note and really reinforce the idea that these aren't legitimate shipments, that and that we are obeying the law.
Right.
And
International.
that we're obeying international law, and that they aren't acts of civil disobedience, that they are acts of civil resistance, they are nonviolent direct actions, and the like.
I know I've heard when people of faith are doing these kinds of things, they often refer to it as holy obedience. It's obedience to a higher law that is merged in with the divine order of how the universe should be functioning if it weren't led astray by greedy, powerful, violent governments. Caitlin, you've worked with the Port Militarization Resistance since it started a year ago. And can you tell us some more just about the culture of the thing, what it's about, how it, what it seeks to do, anything beyond what we've said already?
Yeah, I mean, we have specific strategies and tactics, and we're currently working on building a better regional alliance structure so that we can work more effectively with other communities that are resisting the use of their ports for this illegal war. And we are trying to organize to be more effective in our goals. But we'll talk more about our strategies and goals and campaign plans.
TJ, in mid-February of 2007, the PMR developed something you called the Port Campaign Plan. I wonder, can you summarize the key elements of that?
Well, it was an attempt to give a strategic focus to the work of PMR, and so it contained various elements, a mission statement essentially, an objective, which was to end our community's participation in the illegal war by closing down the Port of Olympia to military shipments bound for Iraq. And we identified specific audiences, and those audiences were sort of the general public, but more importantly, key decision makers who could influence whether those shipments happened or not. So people like the port commissioners, city council members, county commissioners, and county sheriff. And then a whole range of tactics were part of the plan. And it ranged from, at the beginning, public education and awareness building in the community to strategic lobbying of those elected officials and in an attempt to prevent the shipments. And then only if the shipments were not prevented would we move into the later phases of the campaign, which would be the direct action to prevent equipment from reaching the port, or if it reached the port, to prevent it from being loaded on a ship bound for Iraq. So it was really a continuum of actions. And of course, we were successful because the United States military chose not to ship through the Port of Olympia in March of this year. And I believe they did that because of the effectiveness and the work of the PMR based on that plan.
Yeah, and we'll talk some more about what happened then, what happened next. Molly, there's a wonderful statement of nonviolence that PMR came up with. I wonder, can you read that? It's short, but I just find it to be very, very moving. If you could.
Sure. Well, basically, we seek to win over our opposition by changing their minds rather than through degradation or humiliation. So talking with people, spending time, I talked with police officers, and basically we're willing to make personal sacrifices, if that means being arrested or giving up time. You know, a lot of us have put hundreds of hours into this. But we're trying to ensure that the freedom and justice for all people is protected, including our opponents. Because I often believe that we have more in common with our opponents than you might think on the surface. We refrain from physical injuries or assaults. We refrain from verbal harassment and any kind of malicious sabotage. We remember the need for forgiveness and humility, and we always seek to understand each other's actions and the actions of our opposition. We ensure that all of our events and meetings are transparent, open, and inclusive.
It's just a very wonderful, inspiring thing. It shows that there's been good thought going into the organization and good heart, and it's that kind of firm foundation. And you think how different that is from this war that was all built on lies, fear-mongering, distortions, manipulations, greed, deception, all that stuff that the war is based on. No wonder the war is not working very well, and the Port Militarization Resistance movement is really doing well.
You know, I think, Glenn, what
different
you
foundation.
said is really ringing true for me. I think the people that come together to do this work are very committed to trust and trusting one another. And that's real different from living from fear. I think it's a good point.
Phan, can you tell about what happened in Olympia in May 2006? Just like 1 minute to summarize
1 minute.
all that
Okay.
stuff.
A lot happened in May 2006. Last year at the Port of Olympia, when the 3rd Brigade, 2nd Infantry Division was shipping their Stryker vehicles out. The purpose of the 3rd Brigade was to go to Mosul in northern Iraq to secure permanent military bases, but what the military refers to as enduring military bases. And what they ended up doing was being shipped eventually to Baghdad to try to quell the insurgency. But we were there, we were at the Port of Olympia because this was our backyard, this was our port, and we were offended that they would be using our backyard and exporting war and militarization through our backyard. And we were going to show our opposition. And so it was a series of demonstrations at the Port of Olympia by local residents who were just empowering themselves and saying, you know, we're not going to take this. And it started with one person trying to lock the gates at the Port of Olympia. It ended up becoming people blocking the shipment of Stryker vehicles, the convoy that was heading towards the port. And it was a series of 10 days of demonstrations, and it culminated in a mass arrest of 22 people on May 30th, people who were non-violently demonstrating and showing their opposition to this militarization and to this continued occupation. So yeah, it was the first, you know, major action with the Port Militarization Resistance, and the creation of the Port Militarization Resistance.
Now, if somebody relied only on what they've heard through police reports or news media accounts, what impression would they get? What was it that those folks were putting out? And I wonder if you can contrast that with what
Yeah, there's been
you know
so much misinformation. The Olympian also had a lot of, unfortunately, incorrect statements at first with the actions that happened at the port. But you know, it was not like a violent protest well, it was violent, but the violence was coming from the police. The police were using way too much force, unnecessarily, and against unarmed local residents. And what happened was, there's all these people who believe that there was a lot of vandalism, damage, and destruction done, and actually, it wasn't the case. But that belief continues now, that people just came there to cause a riot or anarchy in the more
In the
mainstream
stereotype
sense.
image, yeah.
Mm-hmm. But it was local residents taking back their port, saying this is our port, and those aren't our Stryker vehicles.
Yeah, yeah.
We don't want them here.
Yeah. What's happened since May of 2006 through the court cases, or I know there's been evidence of government misconduct of various kinds.
Yeah.
Can you explain some of that?
I want to add one more thing too
Go
before
ahead.
we go
Sure.
into that, which is that I think the most common misconception is that we were depriving troops of their needed equipment, and that was totally not the case, because they don't send the troops over to Iraq before they send their equipment. They always send the equipment first, and in this case, the 3rd Brigade was not going to deploy until a month later, and we didn't want them to deploy. And what would put the troops most in danger would be to ship them over to Iraq to enforce an illegal occupation. And that's what we were trying to prevent. We had the safety of the troops in mind, as well as the safety of the people of Iraq. And that's why we were there. Now, going into what's happened with the case, right now there's still 16 cases of trespass leveled on activists within PMR, Port Militarization Resistance. And the allegation is that somehow these 16 people had some part of their body over or crossed some kind of invisible line at the Port of Olympia. That sounds weird, but that's what the allegation is. That there was some kind of line that was never described and was never actually, physically existent. There was some kind of line, and somehow 16 of these 16 people had some part of their body over it, and therefore the Thurston County Prosecutor's Office has been pursuing this case for a year now and has been spending an inordinate amount of money and resources to convict these people. And it's just ridiculous, because these people were doing nothing wrong except that they were trying to stop an illegal war and occupation.
As a taxpayer, and as somebody who, as an ordinary citizen of the community here for decades and decades, I want to have an efficient government that doesn't have the courts tied up with silliness or frivolity, and to be seeking convictions against people when there's no real clear line it's a waste of court time, it's a waste of taxpayer dollars.
It's politically motivated.
That's what I was going to ask about, is what are they trying to do? Why is the government so insistent on getting convictions?
Yeah, we don't know who's pulling the strings. We don't know who is so insistent on this. But it's in the hands of these prosecutors to get some kind of conviction on us. But yeah, we do know that it's politically motivated. The Port of Olympia is trying to get $30,000, almost $30,000 out of these 16 people, which doesn't make sense, because all we're being charged with is somehow having a big toe cross in an invisible line. And for some reason that is supposed to cost the Port of Olympia $30,000. I don't think so.
Is there some sense that they just need to make a point and make an example of people as a way of trying to stifle dissent?
Yeah, exactly.
Or something?
They need to make an example. They don't want us to continue resisting, but they don't realize that whatever happens to us, we're going to continue resisting. However they try to punish us for doing what's right, we're resisting because we know it's right. We're not thinking about how this will affect me personally. We have the whole world in our minds. We have the people of Iraq. We have the soldiers in Fort Lewis. We have everyone in our minds, and that's why we're doing it.
And it seems as though the more people understand what's going on and what kind of phony baloney legal processes are underway, the more people are siding with you folks. If they can get themselves weaned from the news releases handed out by the police departments some jurisdictions and so forth. There's evidence of some governmental wrongdoing, surveillance of your group as well. What can you say about that?
What we know, I'm not going to say everything that we know, but what we do know is that at the very least, there was some surveillance of us since January of 2006. So this was way before the port stuff too. This was, for some reason, they were interested in us because we were exercising our First Amendment rights. We were protesting. We were speaking out, and because we were speaking out, all of a sudden we became a threat to some governmental agencies. We don't know exactly which governmental agencies. We know Thurston County Sheriff's Office is involved. We know that there are other agencies involved as well. But they have been monitoring our email. They have been spying on us physically. They've had, there are police reports that say that there were undercover officers checking our movement. So they are, they are observing us and doing it behind our backs. This is taxpayer money here to observe people exercising their free speech rights. It's the people who exercise their rights who are the ones who are the most threatening, it seems.
And these aren't Iraqi nationalists doing the depriving you of your rights. These are
amazingly no
government government funded from this government. Could either Molly or TJ tell us something about what was going on in Tacoma in March of 2007?
Sure.
What actually happened there? And we're running a bit late, so if we can just kind of keep it pretty tight.
Well, as I said earlier, we were successful at blocking the military from using the Port of Olympia for the shipment of the next Stryker brigade. So they shifted to the Port of Tacoma and began sending equipment up there on March 2nd. And because we had been watching this, we were there on March 2nd and continued for about the next 11 or 12 days. And after being successful in Olympia, we shifted our focus to supporting people in Tacoma who were new to this, frankly, and built wonderful solidarity with a lot of people in Pierce County, and were able to confront the military directly on this shipment for the very same reason that Phan mentioned that had occurred the previous year. These were troops that were safely at Fort Lewis and that the Army was trying to put into the middle of a civil war where they had a real risk of killing and being killed. And we said, that's crazy. The best way to protect those soldiers is to keep them here where they're safe at Fort Lewis. And so many of us went there and tried to prevent that shipment. And over the course of that time in early March, a total of 37 people were arrested by the city of Tacoma for a variety of different offenses, and all sorts of different legal processes underway, and will continue to move forward as a result of those arrests.
With, again, a lot of difficulty in getting basic paperwork, and again, the prosecution not turning over documents, and having quite a heck of a time just trying to get basic things available to us.
And the denial of our First Amendment rights in Tacoma was far more severe than it was in Olympia. I mean, just basic suppression of freedom of speech was sort of routine throughout the process.
And very arbitrary, from what I understand.
Very arbitrary.
It's like a because I said so kind of attitude, rather than having something that's really based on what public safety is needed or something. It's just like, you can't do that because I said so.
Yeah.
You have an interesting backpack story. Can you tell us really briefly, because we're running quite late? But
At various points, arbitrary times, at arbitrary places around the Port of Tacoma, the police were restricting people from exercising their First Amendment rights while at the same time wearing a backpack, or at the same time having a water bottle or some other kind of container, a purse. It was very arbitrary. It was up to each individual police officer to determine what was permissible and what wasn't. And we don't have to choose between our First Amendment rights and our Fourth Amendment rights. I do have a right to say no war and wear a backpack at the same time, and any logical, reasonable thinking person would know that.
so tell us the story that involved the Constitution.
Oh yeah. So what all I had in this backpack of mine was a copy of the U.S. Constitution, and I was arrested for that. And I had told the police officer that that was all I had in there. But my police report now says the police officer who arrested me claims that I told him that I had nothing in my backpack, and that when he searched the backpack, all he saw were some papers. So he deliberately left out any reference to the U.S. Constitution, and that's where that's the state of this country.
And lied about you by saying that you had said that it was empty when you had told him that the Constitution
very
was there.
explicitly.
I'm going to infer that perhaps the Constitution was hijacked or confiscated, and at which point we began chanting, "Give us back our Constitution."
Yeah, what a classic street theater.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, the setup, when you're on the side of truth and justice and the American way, like they used to say in the old Superman TV show, truth, justice, and the American way, when you're on the side of the good stuff and these dramatic things play out, it really exposes who's on which side. And how great to be able to come up with that chant, "Give us back our Constitution."
I can't take credit for that.
Well, but it was
I'll credit Zoltan Grossman.
a number of people.
I think there are two things that we talked about earlier that would be worth mentioning. Again, out of Tacoma, I did get some very negative feedback about people very concerned that somehow we were not supporting soldiers. And one of the things that I feel very strongly about is that all of us in our communities need to be prepared for the return of our soldiers who are in incredibly bad shape. A couple of our brigades now are on their 4th tour of duty. So my friends from Vietnam, none of them served more than 6 months without a major break. They just extended. A lot of soldiers had 12-month tours, extended to 15 months. This is post-traumatic stress in the extreme.
Yeah.
So the VA in Seattle is warning us we are going to see much more extreme post-traumatic stress. This means we are bringing the war home, folks. The war is going to be here when we have trained killers, we have mercenary soldiers in numbers that most of us are unaware, and when these guys come home, they have nothing to
Decompress.
They are
Yeah.
just coming home
Yeah.
and they're ready to kill. So the level of violence is going to increase in this country. So when I worked for years with veterans from Vietnam era, what I realized after about 4 months on the job was for some of these people, it might have been kinder had they died than have to come back and relive the nightmares that are endless. We have to help them heal. And we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, I'm so concerned that this support the troops slogan is just a slogan in the hands of a lot of folks because it's Bush and Cheney and all the people in Congress of both parties who vote for the war funding who are abusing these troops, just
Sure.
severely abusing them. And folks here who care about all of humanity are trying to keep them safe. I mean, it's just the opposite of what that slogan
I think it's important to
says.
recognize that a lot of the troops understand exactly what you're saying, Glenn. We had a chance to talk to some of the people in the 4th Brigade that were part of this unit shipping out through Tacoma, and several that I talked to thanked us for being there, thanked us for doing what we were doing to try to stop the war. And as the convoys were coming through, people were giving us thumbs up, they were giving us peace signs. Not everyone. But it was very clear that there's a large segment of these soldiers that don't want to be going over there and are really glad that people like PMR and others are doing everything we can think of to take care of them and to support them.
Yeah.
I would even add an anecdote from the Port of Olympia a year ago. I was up at the courthouse and there was a young man there who was dealing with domestic violence in his own family. He was about to be redeployed with the shipment that was going through the Port of Olympia. And I told him that I was down there and what I was doing and tried to explain that I support bringing our troops home, like 70%, according to a Zogby poll, of troops that want to come home within a year. And he thanked me. He said, "You stop that shipment. I don't want to go. I've missed enough of my son's life already."
Can you tell us something about Aberdeen? Because after the Port Militarization Resistance stopped the use of the Port of Tacoma, then they shipped out of stopped out of the Port of Olympia, then they shipped out of Port of Tacoma, and then with the activities up there, then the next thing was they had to haul all the equipment over to Grays Harbor County and ship it out of Aberdeen. Can you tell us briefly, because we're running quite late, what the Aberdeen thing was about?
Well, I mean, Aberdeen
happened?
really crystallized for me that we have challenged a very powerful political agenda, and we have been very successful so far. They began shipping Apache, Black Hawk, and Kiowa helicopters, as well as Stryker vehicles and medical vehicles through the port at Grays Harbor in Aberdeen. And we began mobilizing rather quickly to organize with people in Aberdeen as well as people in Olympia and Tacoma to try to organize some resistance there, rallies, marches, a presence to show that we will not be complicit in the war. There were, it was a pretty interesting venture for us to work with activists there.
And my understanding is that people in Grays Harbor are now engaging their own local elected officials with the political questions about why are you using our port for that purpose, and so that there's, I mean, it's grassroots and it's from the people themselves. Just like we've had Olympia people active, we've had Tacoma people active, and now we have Grays Harbor people active, and actually Oakland, California, where activists and the Longshore Workers Union actually were able to prevent shipments. So
I think it was really staggering for me to build off of Tacoma, where the suppression of civil liberties was a daily event, the increase. And then to move to Aberdeen, where they had been preparing for weeks prior to have a massive police presence there. What they said, they were expecting the worst. And it's pretty clear, particularly from the Olympians reporting after our large rally on a Sunday, that certain media sources were supporting this idea that that protesters were supporting the war. On the reporting on May 7th, it's a Monday, the Olympian clearly distorts the message that the protesters were out trying to make by alluding to the fact that protesters were participating in the killing of troops by discussing, they have two different titles here, port protesters, and then they say troops killed, the war in this. And so if you just are glancing at this page, it makes the protesters seem like they're complicit in the killing of troops.
And they did a similar thing after the local vigil about the 2000th death in Iraq, when there was a very large peace vigil that was perfectly fine, perfectly nonviolent, perfectly effective and nice. And then there were, at that time, it happened by chance that a ship was coming into port, and the coverage in the Olympian mischaracterized the vigil with by putting a photo of somebody else at the other thing that was totally unrelated, having an argument that was spinning out of control, and they made it look like, you know, it was a way to badmouth this other vigil. And when a number of people contacted the Olympian, they said, well, that was okay to do that because it was dramatic to look at. And we said, but it was the wrong event. You had the photo with the wrong, and they never got it. And we had extensive conversations, and finally they let me write a rebuttal on the editorial page, a featured thing. But they were really quite clueless. And from what you're saying, there's another example of cluelessness or intent, or I don't know what. I would
add that the police force, which was a compilation of a bunch of different police jurisdictions that was supplemented by Seattle forces through a mutual aid agreement, had very little experience with protesters and came there expecting extreme violence and property destruction, and they also were visibly transgressing our First Amendment rights by videotaping and photographing legal, lawful demonstrations that are peaceful. And at times, people who were vigiling or marching would approach the police officers and remind them to protect our constitutionally protected rights of to peaceably assemble. And at which point, some people who weren't aware of that, like in this picture, a peacekeeper is attempting to stop a protester from dialoguing
and she wasn't even a trained peacekeeper. I don't know who she is.
Right.
But
so
that's not somebody who's had peacekeeper training and not an actual. So it's a side issue that
right.
Is maligning. So that's, what lessons have come out of this? What I know it's clear that this has been effective in terms of keeping the Army on the run. What lessons have we gained from this? What's the peace movement learned from this? What's the government learned of this? What's the general public learned from these activities?
Well, I think one important lesson is if they're going to continue to ship this stuff through our ports, it's going to be very, very expensive to someone. That's the reason, in part, that they chose not to ship through Olympia, is that the county sheriff wasn't willing to bear the costs of security, and there wasn't anyone else to pay the bill. So they went to Tacoma. The official estimate is that it costs the city of Tacoma over $500,000 to get that shipment out of the port. And that doesn't include any of the legal costs that are going to drag on for months and potentially years. In Grays Harbor County, the police chief has said he put all his people out on the force, and they broke their budget for that week out there, and they have no desire to or ability to pay for that again. And so, you know, port by port by port, each community is learning this is incredibly expensive, and for cash-strapped local governments who can't even fill potholes and, you know, do the basic necessities for their citizens, you know, how in the world are they going to continue to come up with money for this? So, so it's a big lesson learned for municipalities.
Yeah. Well, part of it should be don't overreact like that. Don't send out all this riot gear for a peaceful event. I mean, the overreaction is what's costing them a lot of the money, it seems.
Yeah.
And when they figured that out, and generally the Olympia police are pretty cool about stuff, has been the experience I've been having for a number of years. Olympia police are generally pretty cool, but that doesn't hold true in a lot of other jurisdictions, and it's not uniform either.
I think one of the other lessons learned for some of us is an increasing awareness that we're living in a police state. And when I just recently found out after the fact that Gregoire has now decided that we're going to have these chips in our driver's licenses so that we are monitored wherever we go. I mean, I am just pretty enraged with, you know, I know that, you know, my phone conversations are monitored, my email, you know, and now if the next time I get a driver's license, there's going to be this chip in there. I think there's some very serious things for us to look at in terms of where this country's going as our rights are diminishing and the power of the police are increasing.
I think that I would also add that it's become increasingly clear to me that Americans and citizens are thirsting for a way to tangibly make a difference, and that is something that's been really important to the peace movement, is to find some place, some way to affect change. And it's been really powerful, and the momentum that's been building through this movement, I think, has been evidence of the fact that we're ready, and as well as the media coverage, which, although there are a few instances of, you know, gross violations of journalistic principles, there has been an increasingly favorable light from the media because, you know, they're consumeristic in their, you know, way of presenting and Americans are looking for ways that the war can end.
Well, and this is something that extends across the political spectrum, because one of the people who's been very strongly opposed to the war is Congressman Ron Paul from Texas, who is extremely right-wing on so many issues, but he's been against the war since the beginning, and he continues to speak out and act and vote against the war in a bunch of ways. And there are people, if you talk about concerns about, you know, over-policing and the police state and the surveillance and stuff, people at the very conservative wing of the spectrum are concerned about that. Libertarians, I mean, the Libertarian Party has been opposed to this war continuously, just like the Green Party and the Socialist Party.
Everyone should be.
It's the parties in the middle that support it, but if you get out of the middle.
They're not in the middle.
They aren't
They're
in the
the
middle.
extreme.
Yeah.
Let's be very clear
Yeah.
about that. The middle is where 70% of the public is who wants this war to end.
One of the other ironies about this that we've been seeing in the last several years is the notion of having free speech zones where the government will say, yeah, you can have freedom of speech way over here where nobody can see you in this remote location away from where the action is. I've always believed that the whole America is a free speech zone. I mean, our whole nation is one giant free speech zone. But they're saying, no, you can only do free speech way over here where nobody can see you. I find that to be outrageous.
That was actually organized in Aberdeen. We had an area that was a designated public assembly area, and many of us found that so revulsive that we decided that it was not worth trampling on our civil liberties in that
Yeah,
way.
it was a big, muddy, grassy field
Yeah,
as well.
it was muddy, rainy weather, and then they put you in a muddy area. It was like,
Well, in Tacoma, it
Especially
shrunk
thankful.
by the hour. Or, well, certainly each night, it was a smaller and smaller place to be.
yeah. When we were preparing for the phone and I was talking with you on the phone, you said, police don't need to play chicken with us. We aren't playing that game. And I thought, what a great insight.
Yeah, because the police, they come with this kind of view that they have to show force and show their strength and to see who's going to back down first. That's not what we're there for. We're not there to play chicken with the police. We're there because we have legitimate concerns and we're asserting our First Amendment rights. And then the police turn it into something like they're the targets. They turn themselves into targets. And then they also escalate the situation, especially in Tacoma, with all these police officers in riot gear when nobody is doing anything wrong. All of a sudden they show up looking to rumble, ready to escalate. And that is the escalation, you would think.
It becomes provocative, and the whole riot gear thing with the dark, all that stuff, is a depersonalizing, a dehumanizing, a barrier kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I know from what I've heard from people who've been directly involved, in many cases in violation of the law, they don't let you know what their badge number is, and it's this whole depersonalization barrier thing, whereas the movement that you folks are in is very engaging. And it's a very different. So, what's next? What are you looking ahead to? We're kind of wrapping up the hour, and I want to look at what directions we've had successes thus far in Olympia, Tacoma, and organizing in the Grays Harbor area. There's interest in other Puget Sound area ports. And I know, like I mentioned earlier, Oakland, California, activists and the Longshore Workers Union were able to stop a shipment.
I think people are beginning to understand the best way to stop this war is to figure out whatever their community's connection is to it and focus on that. I know I've talked to people across the country over the last couple of months, and they don't have ports, but they have a recruiting station, or they have an air base, or they have some type of military thing. And so people are beginning to think in terms of what's their community's direct connection to this war and how do they impact that. And I think that's a very good trend, and I think to the degree that we can support each other in communities and build a regional and a national grassroots resistance movement, that's how we're going to stop this thing. It's not going to be because Congress or the president says, oh, it's time to pull the troops out. It's going to be because they can no longer get the equipment and the people there because communities have said we won't be complicit in this.
It's another think globally and act locally thing. It's another example of that, because Congress and the executive branch are the last ones ever to figure out what's going on. Real movements happen from the grassroots up. And the news media are always the last to figure it out.
I would also add to that I think it's crucial for, especially for us as a very campaign-oriented organization, to work towards making links, like they did in Oakland, to the reduction in funding that, because of the war, that goes to education and healthcare, and the lack of high-paying living wage jobs for people in America, and supporting the longshore workers, but also helping for all of us to make the links between this illegal war and the failure of our economy in this country.
Yeah, I know there's a huge amount of information out there about what's really happening with Iraq, what's really happening with grassroots social change movements and things, and it's not in the mainstream press, it's elsewhere. So I encourage people to look. I know there's some information about port activities at the website for the Olympia Movement for Justice and Peace, which is www.omjp.org. And there's also some at the Pierce County, the United for Peace of Pierce County website, www.ufppc.org. a lot of good information about the port-related activities there. And then get on to some of the other good alternative websites and follow the links.
We
It's
also
amazing.
talked a bit, Glenn, about reminding people. A lot of folks have asked me about how they can be supportive. They may not be ready to do some kind of direct action, but boy, there are roles for people in terms of helping with all kinds of things, media and a number of things. We need to be, raising legal funds and different things.
And the peace vigils. I mean, Olympia FOR does 2 peace vigils every week. Wednesday noon hour at the Legion and Capitol Way in the corner of Sylvester Park, and Friday 4:30 to 6 p.m. At the Percival Landing corner at 4th and Water Street. Women in Black from 5 to 6 p.m. on 4th Avenue near the fountain. Lots and lots of other activities going on to plug into and connect. I wonder if we could get a closing thought from each of you, a relatively brief closing thought. And in any sequence you want. It doesn't have to be left to right. It could be right to left. It could be mixed. So.
Well, I'll just go ahead. That we do have an opportunity to empower ourselves. A lot of people are feeling disempowered in this country right now, understandably, but that you really need to think, like, what can you do? You don't have to be a professional activist. I have a full-time job. I don't do this professionally, but I'm doing what I can, and that we all can. And we have to think, and we have to realize that this is something real that's going on. The 3rd Brigade that shipped out partially through the Port of Olympia, around 30 soldiers have been killed there. The 4th Brigade through the Port of Tacoma, within the first week or two that they were in Iraq, 3 of them have been killed. Mm-hmm. This is real stuff we're talking about. This is not a game, and we need to take responsibility for our nation right now.
Yeah.
I like what Phan's saying, and it reminds me that I think we need to start connecting things that are going on globally. We need to start asking, what is the connection between what's going on in Lebanon, in Palestine, in Iraq? Why are we not hearing about Osama bin Laden? There's so many things that are interconnected, and those are the questions we need to ask each other, and we need to do a lot of looking at how each of these things connects back to our corporate government.
2 suggestions. The first is hold your elected officials accountable at all levels, from school boards and city councils directly up through the president. And if they're voting to continue this war, and if they're voting to provide the funding, they are not opposed to the war, and you need to understand that, and you need to get them out of there. Secondly, going back to PMR and the idea of a continuum of actions, I think everyone is somewhere on that continuum of actions. And what I tell people is just move one more rung up the ladder. If you've never written a letter, write a letter. If you've written a lot of letters, go to a protest. If you're tired of protesting, think about supporting direct action.
Great.
And I would just add that I think it's important to work towards feeling empowered and finding those avenues at which that you can become the citizen that you want to create this world into, and making those social connections. So.
Great. Thanks to all of you folks. I want to remind the viewers that when World War II ended, the United States led the way in holding Nazi war criminals accountable. We led a process that developed the Nuremberg principles. Those principles apply not just to Nazis, they apply to every nation and the people of every nation. And they say that it's illegal under international law to do these kinds of atrocities, and that to say that you're just following orders is not an excuse. So every person is accountable, and we have a copy of that if somebody wants to read that. It's amazing, good stuff. I want to thank Caitlin and TJ and Molly and Phan. I want to thank the folks who've been watching. I want to thank you also for thinking about the content that we've been sharing during this hour. For information about a variety of issues on peace, social justice, and nonviolence, contact the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation at 491-9093 or www.olyfor.org. We're all one human family, and we all share one planet. The world needs what you have to offer because you are part of the solution. Please do whatever you can. Thank you.